Some of the most influential scholars of Jewish and of Holocaust history have published autobiographies which include accounts of their personal experiences as Jews living in Europe during the early 20th century. Such accounts appear in the oeuvre of, amongst others, George Massey, Saul Friedlander, Walter Laqueur, George Eggers, Peter Gay, Herbert Strauss, Fritz Stern, Raoul Hilberg that we just heard, Gerda Lerner, Lucy Davidovich, etc. The list is longer. Though they have occasionally been referred to, the autobiographies of these historians have not yet received adequate scholarly attention. This disregard is quite surprising given the analytic potential of these texts. Since the experience of the Holocaust is part of all of these historians' lives, its narrative integration in their autobiographical writing may offer a hitherto unnoticed perspective on one of the central challenges, intellectual challenges, of post-Holocaust Jewish existence and historiography, the question of how to comprehend the rupture in Jewish history that the Shoah denotes, whether, and if so, how to locate this event within a continuous or discontinuous model of Jewish history. I want to speak about the narrative integration of the experience of the survivor or escape from the Holocaust, which we find in the published autobiographies of Jewish historians. I thereby apply the interdisciplinary method of narratology developed by theorists of literature and famously adopted into historical research by Hayden White. My lecture refers to the debates about historical representations of the Holocaust, most famously documented, but obviously not the only, in the proceedings of a UCLA conference in 1990, probing the limits of representations. The narrative integration of the Holocaust in autobiographical texts results in a confrontation with the poetics of autobiography, a confrontation not entirely unlike the debates about the proper poetics of the writing of the Holocaust dating back to that conference. My paper has 3 parts. I dedicate the first part to a short narratological interpretation of textual rupture and continuity in one selected autobiography, Herbert Strauss's In the Eye of the Storm, and I have brought here the table of contents in German, I'm sorry. It's the German translation, obviously. How does the narrative integration of the catastrophe work in his text? The second part of the paper discusses the poetics of this text and of others in this corpus, struggling with the conventions of autobiography, by way of applying Michael Rothberg's notion of dramatic realism that has gained traction in literary studies, but not, as far as I can see, in history. I parallel the writing about the Holocaust in the autobiographical and in the historiographical genre, showing that their respective struggles with a proper representation of rupture lead them towards the pragmatic affirmation of realism. Now, my first part, the narrative integration of the Holocaust in Strauss's autobiography. In order to give you an impression of the difficulty of the narrative integration of the Holocaust in an autobiography, and in order to show the relevance of this issue, I outline this process in one autobiography, the autobiography of Herbert Arthur Strauss, that goes by the English title In the Eye of the Storm. Strauss was born in 1918 in Würzburg into a rural Orthodox family, went to Berlin in the mid-1930s, and was there one of the last students at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, escaped to Switzerland in 1943, so really late, after he was in Berlin underground for 1.5 years. He completed a Ph.D. in history at the University of Bern about the Paulskirchen Parliament, which is really a historical dissertation, and finally went to New York in 1945, where he taught at City College. In 1982, he was appointed founding director of the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism in Berlin. In his autobiography, we find a curious discrepancy between the table of contents, which I would call the paratextual structure of the narration, and the continuous text, which is the textual structure of the narration. The table of contents lists 9 chapters, which are organized chronologically. The first 6 chapters, the first 6 chapter titles signify a very common development of a young man in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. Strauss does not, in the titles of the chapters 1 to 6, that is German Jewish piety, to Abitur, allude to the political change in 1933. Instead, he depicts his Bildungsweg, the course of education, with titles that denote stages in his education. For example, piety, high school, apprenticeship, youth movement, general studies. This Bildungsweg goes from religiosity and a traditional occupation in the rural Franconian periphery to Zionist activism and self-confident Jewish scholarship in the metropolis Berlin. The chapter titles 1 to 6 picture a life that could easily be described by use of the traditional means of autobiographical writing. In this sense, these chapters present what may be termed a successful life story, a narrative which gains structural closure by means of integration into society. That is the model we have from the 19th century of writing an autobiography. Bildungsweg was the sanctioned path that allowed for narrative integration into well-established narrative patterns. The structure of Strauss's table of contents shows an awareness of this pattern. It is not the day of going underground that serves as kind of the turning point of the author's life story here, but rather the final stage of his formal education, his Abitur. Chapter titles 7 to 9, on the other hand, are semantically pejorative, forced labor, underground, escape, and denote existential experiences, implying not a Bildungsweg, but rather a survivor's autobiography. The reading of the actual text, however, and especially of chapter 6, the turning point of the table of contents, shows that the Abitur does not represent in Strauss's life story what it would represent in a conventional autobiography where Bildung is the quintessential theme. Without any chance of really exercising the freedom that comes with graduation, Strauss experienced the course of his life to be set. In March 1942, the symbol of institutional public appreciation is reduced to mere absurdity, and this is a quote, Absurdität. The actual Abitur exams are not even placed in chapter 6, but in chapter 7, forced labor. He did that between 2 days of forced labor he had to do in the sanitation work in Berlin. The Abitur denotes the turning point to catastrophe, which signifies an irreconcilability of conventional autobiographical patterns and Strauss's remembered experience. The planned, cohesive narrative or paratextual structure falls apart through actual narration. Both the table of contents and the text depict a break not only in the life story of the protagonist, but also in the structural pattern that it applies in the Bildungsweg pattern. The crisis of genre seems to correspond with the actual life crisis encountered by the author, while the pattern of the Bildungsweg strives for textual closure, which on the level of the content means a successful life and a blissful integration into, let's face it, an exclusive society of learned men. In the Eye of the Storm offers no such textual closure, but rather failure, exclusion, persecution. Now, I want to say a couple of words about the poetics of the text, and then using it as an example, going on to the, drawing broader conclusions about this corpus of texts. The preface of In the Eye of the Storm explicitly invokes autobiographical aesthetics. I quote, "I hoped that by way of the shape of its presentation, my story would gain a kind of center and continuity which it did not possess by itself." Well, this is a programmatic statement about the poetics of autobiography, which refers to the designing process of any form of autobiographical writing, and is thus a marker for self-reflection and aesthetical awareness. The statement also indicates an inducement to write an autobiography, the capacity of writing to lend shape to an unshaped and therefore incomprehensible life story. In the closing lines of In the Eye of the Storm, the tension between life and life story, between textual representation and contemporary experience is taken up again, referring to the notion of understanding. I quote, "The real difficulty would be to understand myself and the ruptures in the continuity of my life." We find here doubts about continuity, unity, and the consistency of life, and they are poignantly expressed. So the preface and last paragraphs of the book exhibit a startling degree of genre reflection. Given this degree of reflection, I want to ask one question. If, as we have seen, the application of the classical autobiographical pattern fails, then why apply this genre tradition at all? The easy way out would be to assume that the historian autobiographers simply chose the most common style because they were not able or willing to write sophisticated and innovative literature. However, to sit down and write an autobiography, even if the implicit genre the writer has in mind is memoir, means to be confronted with literally thousands of years of autobiographical tradition, as well as with the systematic demands of the genre. Everybody who has tried to tell his or her life story, even orally, knows what I'm talking about. We just don't make it up. It's already there. There are many patterns that we are referring to consciously or subconsciously. And as we have seen in the example of Strauss, the texts do express an awareness of this confrontation with the genre. In my opinion, the poetics of these texts are what Geoffrey Hartman has called narrations in search of themselves. At first glance, most of them are conventional, realist narratives that follow the model of the 19th century Bildungsroman. The dominant poetics of these texts is a poetics of reporting. Frequently, the narrator distances himself from the protagonist and the narrated situation by submitting them to historical objectification. By introducing scholarly historical observations, say, background information about the working class in the 1920s in northern Franconia, the narrator positions himself at the center of the reader's perception and narrates the protagonist's experiences with great distance. Such a way of narration, evoking rather scholarly discourse than personal accounts, is clearly oriented more towards the universalism of the historian's profession than towards the particularity of a single person's past experience. Given the time of these texts and their publication in the 1980s and later, in what we might call, and this is a very dense notion, Adorno's chronotope after Auschwitz, so after he, all of you know this verdict and so on and so on. We're living in this. And the internal struggle with the convention, so given the time of these text publication and the internal struggle with the convention, which I have shown by the example of Strauss, this adaptation of conventional autobiographies is surprising. This poetics does not relate to the fundamental insecurity about epistemology and the subject in 20th century, but insists on the ongoing validity of the realist mode of writing and, let's say, the power of the omniscient narrator, in a way. Obviously, historian autobiographers who escaped or survived the Holocaust turn towards conventional autobiography because it is identified with realist narration and the enduring possibility of referring to the experienced events in some kind of direct way. My third and last part. Narration in search of itself might just as well be the title of the methodological debates that surfaced among Holocaust historians in the late 20th century, debates about what we could call the proper poetics of Holocaust history. The difficulties in attempting to continue the autobiographical project, that is, of finding ways to adequately express oneself, are not unlike the problems of a continued historical project to find a way to depict history adequately, that is, scholarly appropriately. The experience of rupture that the Holocaust represented for the historians in the corpus poses a severe epistemological problem to the traditional ways of writing a life story, but also to any historical methodology. In historical scholarship, this question of continuity has been asked most prominently, obviously, by Saul Friedlander's intervention against the leveling of the horror of the Shoah in conventional historiography. This intervention followed Friedlander's public debate with Martin Brochard, yes, but it also owes much to his ongoing exchange with Hayden White ever since the famous conference. The literary aspect of narrative history has, in the meantime, become a genuine category and even a commonplace. Although Friedlander and White far from settled their argument, Friedlander has been holding on to what White calls the realist mode of writing, claiming it to be the genuine mode of historical narration, especially with regard to the Holocaust. For such seemingly contradicting approaches of applying realism yet struggling with it, I want to adopt Michael Rothberg's notion of traumatic realism, a term he took from Hal Foster. I think this term applies for both the autobiographies and the writing of history related to the Holocaust. As Rothberg has pointed out, realism must be understood as a form of production, as a textual strategy, and not as a style or an epoch that was and is not anymore. Realism is thus not only the traditional approach towards the genres of autobiography and historiography, but also an innovative strategy to cope with the narrative rupture which the Holocaust represents. Both autobiography and historiography apply this strategy in their interaction within their contexts because, even though it has lost its matter-of-factness, realist writing has not entirely lost its function. I quote Rothberg, "Dramatic realism is an attempt to produce the traumatic events as an object of knowledge. This is particularly true for historian autobiographies, which are, among many other things, stories about the attempt to regain a position in the arena called objectivity. During the last 30 years, this very arena has experienced the explicit introduction of the category of authenticity to measure historical objectivity. Towards this request of authenticity, the autobiographers as well as the historian's answer has been realism and the reluctance to write literarily in order to enable an experience to be known. And by the realist, I mean what would be conceivable as an alternative way of writing an autobiography. We have two famous examples that go a different path. Obviously, it's Friedlander's own autobiography that is achronological and fragmentary and so on and so on. And we recently have seen the publication of Otto Dovkurko's memoir autobiography that is obviously also draws on diaries and dreams and thus, you know, not just quote poems, but actually write in a lyrical language itself. So, the second one, Kulka in Jerusalem. Even Friedlander, whose Nazi Germany's and the Jews, Alon Confino has described a fundamentally literary piece of historiography, programmatically and pragmatically turns towards realism as a strategy of authentication, implicitly identifying literary writing with fiction. I quote Friedlander from a conference in 2011. In a historical representation of the Holocaust, the authenticity of the diarist's identity and the veracity of the description or comment as perceived within its contemporary context give full support to the testimony. Even a hint of fiction cancels it. Thank you for listening to me.